God is Not a Fish Inspector by W.D. Valgardson. Although Emma made no noise as she descended, Fussy Bergman knew his daughter was watching him from the bottom of the stairs. "God will punish you," she promised in a low, intense voice. "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," he snapped. "God's not a fish inspector. He doesn't work for the government." By the light of the front ring of the kitchen stove, he had been drinking a cup of coffee mixed half and half with whiskey. Now he shifted in his captain's chair so as to partly face the stairs. Though he was unable to make out more than the white blur of Emma's nightgown, after living with her for 48 years he knew exactly how she would look if he turned on the light. She was tall and big-boned, with the square, pugnacious face of a bulldog. Every inch of her head would be crammed with metal curlers, and her angular body hidden by a plain white cotton shift that hung from her broad shoulders like a tent. Whenever she was angry with him, she always stood rigid and white-lipped, her hands clenched at her sides. "You prevaricate," she warned. "You will not be able to prevaricate at the gates of heaven." He drained his cup, sighed, and pulled on his jacket. As he opened the door, Fussy said, "He made fish to catch. There's no place in the Bible where it says you can't catch fish when you are 70. "You will be the ruin of us," she hissed as he closed the door on her. She was aggressive and overbearing, but he knew her too well to be impressed. Behind her forcefulness there was always that trace of self-pity nurtured in plain women who go unmarried until they think they have been passed by. Even if they eventually found a husband, the self-pity returned to change their determination into a whine. Still, he was glad to have the door between them. This morning, as every morning, he had awakened at 3. Years before, he had trained himself to get up at that time, and now, in spite of his age, he never woke more than 5 minutes after the hour. He was proud of his early rising, for he felt it showed he was not, like many of his contemporaries, relentlessly sliding into the endless blur of senility. Each morning, because he had become reconciled to the idea of dying, he felt on the instant of his awakening a spontaneous sense of amazement at being alive. The thought never lasted longer than the brief time between sleep and consciousness, but the good feeling lingered throughout the day. When Fussy stepped outside, the air was cold and damp. The moon that hung low in the west was pale and fragile and very small. 50 feet from the house, the breakwater that ran along the rear of his property loomed like the purple spine of some great beast guarding the land from a lake, which seemed, in the darkness, to go on forever. Holding his breath to still the noise of his own breathing, Fussy listened for a cough or the scuff of gravel that would mean someone was close by, watching and waiting. But the only sound was the muted rubbing of his skiff against the piling to which it was moored. Half a mile away, where the land was lower, rows of gas boats, roped 5 abreast, lined the docks. The short, stubby boats with their high cabins, the gray surface of the docks, and the dark water were all tinged purple from the mercury lamps. At the harbor mouth, high on a thin spire, a red light burned like a distant star. Behind him he heard the door open, and for a moment he was afraid Emma might begin to shout, or worse still, turn on the back door light and alert his enemies, but she did neither. Above all things, Emma was afraid of scandal, and would do anything to avoid causing an unsavory rumor to be attached to her own or her husband's name. Her husband, John Smith, was as bland and inconsequential as his name. Moon-faced, with wide blue eyes and a small mouth, above which sat a carefully trimmed mustache, he was a head shorter than Emma and a good 50 pounds lighter. 6 years before, he had been transferred to the Eddyville branch of the Bank of Montreal. His transfer from Calgary to a small town in Manitoba was the bank's way of letting him know that there would be no more promotions. He would stay in Eddyville until he retired. A year after he arrived, Emma had married him, and instead of her moving out, he had moved in. For the last 2 years, under Emma's prodding, John had been taking a correspondence course in theology so that when he no longer worked at the bank, he could be a full-time preacher. On the evenings, when he wasn't balancing the bank's books, he labored over the multiple-choice questions in the famous preacher's course that he received each month from the one true and only Word of God Church in Mobile, Alabama. Because of a freak in the atmosphere one night, while she had been fiddling with the radio, Emma had heard a gospel hour advertising the course, and although neither she nor John had ever been south of Minneapolis and had never heard of the one true and only Word of God Church before, she took it as a sign and immediately enrolled her husband in it. It cost $500. John's notes urged him not to wait to answer his call, but to begin ministering to the needy at once, for the judgment day was always imminent. In anticipation of the end of the world and his need for a congregation once he retired, he and Emma had become zealous missionaries, cramming their Volkswagen with a movie projector, a record player, films, trays of slides, religious records for every occasion, posters and pamphlets, all bought or rented from the one true and only Word of God Church. Since the townspeople were obstinately Lutheran, and since John did not want to give offense to any of his bank's customers, he and Emma had hunted converts along the gray dirt roads that led past tumble-down farmhouses, the inhabitants of which were never likely to enter a bank. Pusey did not turn to face his daughter, but hurried away, because he knew he had no more than an hour and a half until dawn. His legs were fine as he crossed the yard, but by the time he had mounted the steps that led over the breakwater, then climbed down 15 feet to the shore, his left knee had begun to throb. Holding his leg rigid to ease the pain, he waded out, loosened the ropes, and heaved himself away from the shore. As soon as the boat was in deep water, he took his seat and set both oars in the oarlocks he had carefully muffled with strips from an old shirt. For a moment he rested his hands on his knees, the oars rising like two small wings from a cumbersome body. Then he straightened his arms, dipped the oars cleanly into the water, and in one smooth motion pulled his hands towards his chest. The first few strokes were even and graceful, but then, as a speck of pain like a grain of sand formed in his shoulder, the sweep of his left oar became shorter than his right. Each time he leaned against the oars, the pain grew until it was, in his mind, a bent shingle nail twisted and turned in his shoulder socket. With the exertion, a ball of gas formed in his stomach, making him uncomfortable, as quickly as a balloon being blown up. It expanded until his lungs and heart were cramped, and he couldn't draw in a full breath. Although the air over the lake was cool, sweat ran from his hairline. At his 200th stroke, he shipped his left oar and pulled a coil of rope with a large hook from under the seat. After checking to see that it was securely tied through the gunwale, he dropped the rope overboard and once more began to row. Normally, he would have had a buoy made from a slender tamarack pole, a block of wood, and some lead weights to mark his net. But he no longer had a fishing license, so his net had to be sunk below the surface where it could not be seen by the fish inspectors. 5 more strokes of the oars, and the rope went taut. He lifted both oars into the skiff, then, standing in the bow, began to pull. The boat responded sluggishly, but gradually it turned, and the cork line that lay hidden under 2 feet of water broke the surface. He grasped the net, freed the hook, and began to collect the mesh until the lead line appeared. For once he had been lucky, and the hook had caught the net close to one end, so there was no need to backtrack. Hand over hand he pulled, being careful not to let the corks and leads bang against the bow, for on the open water sound carried clearly for miles. In the first 2 fathoms there was a freshly caught pickerel. As he pulled it toward him, it beat the water with its tail, making light, slapping sounds. His fingers were cramped, But Fusi managed to catch the fish around its soft middle and, with his other hand, work the mesh free of the gills. It was then that the pain in his knee forced him to sit. Working from the seat was awkward and cost him precious time, but he had no choice, for the pain had begun to inch up the bone toward his crotch. He wiped his forehead with his hand and cursed his infirmity. When he was 20, he had thought nothing of rowing 5 miles from shore to lift 5 and 6 gangs of nets, and then, nearly knee-deep in fish, row home again. Now, he reflected bitterly, 1/4 of a mile and 1 net were nearly beyond him. Externally, he had changed very little over the years. He was still tall and thin, his arms and legs corded with muscle. His belly was hard. His long face, with its pointed jaw, showed his age the most, that and his hands. His face was lined until it seemed there was nowhere the skin was smooth. His hands were scarred and heavily veined. His hair was gray, but it was still thick.